Starbucks horror stories, the dark roast. Jenna loved autumn, the crisp air, the fiery leaves, and most of all, the return of Starbucks pumpkin spice latte. Every year, without fail, she would mark the date on her calendar and treat herself to a warm cup of the seasonal brew. This year was no different, except it would be her last. The small Starbucks at the corner of Pine and Elm was a cozy haven for students, freelancers, and people like Jenna who simply wanted a break from the daily grind. It was an old building, and the store was packed with charm. The creaky floorboards and dim lighting added to its appeal. Even the baristas seemed handpicked for their friendly, albeit slightly quirky personalities. Jenna walked in, the familiar scent of coffee beans and cinnamon greeting her like an old friend. She smiled at Tom, the barista with the shaggy hair and thick-rimmed glasses. He waved back, his smile a little too wide, but Jenna didn't think much of it. "The usual?" Tom asked, already reaching for a cup. "Pumpkin spice latte, extra whipped cream, please," Jenna replied with a grin. She handed over her loyalty card, watching as Tom swiped it with a practiced hand. As Jenna waited, she noticed something odd. The music playing overhead wasn't the usual mellow jazz or indie tunes. It was a scratchy, old-timey song, one she couldn't quite place. The lyrics were barely audible, but they seemed to drone on about a lost soul wandering through dark woods. Goosebumps prickled her skin, but she shook it off. It was just music, after all. Tom placed the cup on the counter, sliding it toward her. "Enjoy, Jenna." She took the cup, noticing her name scrawled in a shaky hand. The letters looked off, almost like they were written by someone unfamiliar with the English alphabet. She frowned, but decided it wasn't worth fussing over. The first sip was divine, as always, the perfect balance of sweet and spicy. Jenna found her usual spot by the window, a cozy armchair bathed in the soft glow of the autumn sun. She pulled out her laptop, ready to lose herself in her writing. But something felt different. The familiar comfort of the cafe was replaced by an unsettling heaviness, as if the very air was thick with unseen tension. Half an hour passed, and Jenna found herself staring blankly at the screen. Her fingers hovered over the keys, but no words came. She took another sip of her latte, hoping the caffeine would jolt her brain into action. Instead, she felt a strange dizziness wash over her. The room seemed to tilt, the walls closing in ever so slightly. She blinked, trying to clear her head. Her gaze drifted to the counter where Tom stood, his back to her as he chatted with another barista. But something was off. His movements were stiff, almost robotic. The other barista, a girl with bright pink hair, turned toward Jenna and their eyes met. Jenna froze. The girl's eyes were wide, too wide, and her pupils were mere pinpricks in a sea of white. She smiled, a slow, creeping grin that stretched far too wide across her face, revealing rows of unnaturally sharp teeth. Jenna's heart pounded in her chest. She blinked again, and the girl was normal, just a regular barista with a friendly smile. Jenna shook her head, trying to dispel the image. She was just tired, she told herself. Maybe she'd been staring at the screen too long. She took another sip of her drink, but it tasted bitter now, the sweetness gone. She set the cup down, pushing it away with a trembling hand. As she tried to refocus on her writing, the scratchy song from earlier returned, louder this time. The lyrics were clearer now, speaking of a curse placed on a small town, its inhabitants doomed to repeat their worst nightmares, again and again. Jenna shivered, pulling her sweater tighter around her shoulders. She glanced around the cafe. The usual hum of conversation was gone, replaced by an eerie silence. The other customers sat in their seats, staring blankly ahead, their cups untouched. Jenna's pulse quickened. Something was very wrong. She gathered her things, deciding to leave. But as she stood, her vision blurred, and a wave of nausea hit her. She stumbled, catching herself on the edge of the table. The room spun around her, the once comforting space now a twisted labyrinth of dark corners and shadowy figures. Jenna tried to call out, but her voice was trapped in her throat. She looked toward the counter, but Tom was gone. The other barista, the one with the pink hair, was standing there, watching her with that same unnerving smile. The other customers slowly turned in their seats, their eyes vacant, faces twisted in expressions of horror. She backed away, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The door seemed miles away, and the more she tried to reach it, the farther it seemed to get. The lights flickered, casting long, distorted shadows across the floor. The music grew louder, the lyrics now a haunting chant that echoed in her skull. Jenna's legs gave out, and she crumpled to the floor. The last thing she saw before darkness claimed her was Tom's face, leaning over her, his eyes black as coal, his mouth twisted into that same, unnatural smile. Jenna woke up in her own bed, drenched in sweat. She sat up, gasping for air, her heart racing. It was just a dream, she told herself, just a horrible nightmare. She looked around her room, everything in its place, the morning sun filtering through the curtains. But as she reached for her phone, she noticed something on her nightstand. A Starbucks cup, her name scrawled on it in that same shaky hand. She stared at it, her blood turning to ice. The cup was full, and the drink was still warm. Starbucks Horror Stories, The Midnight Shift. Lucy had just started her job at the local Starbucks, a cozy little store tucked away in a quiet neighborhood. It was her first week, and she'd already gotten used to the routine, evening lulls, and everything in between. The customers were friendly, the staff was welcoming, and the tips weren't half bad. One night, her manager, Pete, approached her with an unusual request. "Hey, Lucy, can you cover the midnight shift tonight?" Pete asked, his tone oddly serious. "Mandy called in sick, and I'm desperate. You'd be alone, but it's usually quiet. Just a couple of regulars. Easy money." Lucy hesitated. She'd never worked that late before, but she needed the hours. Plus, she wasn't one to back down from a challenge. "Sure, why not?" she replied with a confident smile. Pete's relief was palpable. "Great, just keep an eye on the clock. The store automatically locks at 2 a.m. Don't stay a minute past that, okay?" Lucy laughed. "Got it, boss. I'll be out of here before the clock strikes 2. The shift started off uneventfully. A few regulars came in for their late-night caffeine fixes, exchanging friendly banter before heading back out into the night. By 1 a.m., the store was empty, and Lucy found herself wiping down the counters, humming along to the soft jazz playing over the speakers. The minutes ticked by, the night dragging on in the way that only quiet nights can. At 1:30, she started her closing duties, counting down the register and cleaning the machines. Just as she was about to mop the floor, the doorbell jingled, signaling a new customer. Lucy looked up, surprised. She hadn't expected anyone else this late. A man in a long, dark coat stood in the doorway, his face partially obscured by the brim of his hat. He moved slowly, almost deliberately, toward the counter. "Good evening," Lucy greeted him with a forced cheerfulness. "What can I get for you?" The man didn't respond immediately. He just stood there, staring at the menu as if deep in thought. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and gravelly. "A cup of your darkest roast." Lucy nodded, trying to shake off the unease that had settled over her. She prepared the coffee quickly, eager to serve him and get him out the door. As she handed him the cup, she noticed his hands, pale and gaunt, like they hadn't seen the sun in years. He dropped a few coins onto the counter, their metallic clink echoing through the empty store. "Thanks," Lucy said, forcing a smile. The man didn't reply, just took his coffee and shuffled over to a corner table, where he sat down without taking off his coat. Lucy watched him for a moment, the uneasy feeling growing stronger. There was something off about him, something that made her skin crawl. She glanced at the clock, 1:45 a.m. Just 15 more minutes and she could close up. She returned to her cleaning, trying to ignore the man's presence. But every time she looked up, he was staring at her, his eyes dark and hollow, like bottomless pits. She tried to keep busy, but her hands were shaking now, her breath coming in shallow gasps. At 1:55, Lucy decided she couldn't take it anymore. She walked over to the man, trying to keep her voice steady. "Sir, we're closing in a few minutes. I'm going to have to ask you to leave." The man looked up at her, his eyes locking onto hers. "But I haven't finished my coffee," he said, a slow, unsettling smile spreading across his face. His teeth were unnaturally white, almost glowing in the dim light. Lucy swallowed hard. "I'm sorry, but it's store policy. We close at 2 a.m. sharp." The man didn't move. He just sat there, staring at her with that unnerving smile. Lucy backed away, her heart pounding. She looked at the clock, 1:59 a.m. She had to get him out of there. "Please, sir, you need to leave now," she said, her voice trembling. The man stood up slowly, his movements deliberate and almost exaggerated. He walked toward her, his eyes never leaving hers. You shouldn't be here alone, he whispered, his voice sending chills down her spine. Things happen in the dark. Lucy's breath hitched. The clock struck 2 a.m., and the store's automatic lock clicked into place, sealing the door with a resounding thud. The lights flickered, casting eerie shadows across the room. Panic surged through her. Please, just leave, she begged, her voice rising in pitch. The man stopped, just inches from her, his cold breath brushing against her skin. You can't escape, he said softly. Once you're here, you're part of it. Lucy stumbled back, her mind racing. What did he mean? Part of what? She turned to run, but her feet felt like lead. The room seemed to stretch and warp around her, the walls closing in, the shadows growing longer and darker. She grabbed her phone, frantically dialing Pete's number. It rang once, twice, then went to voicemail. She tried again, but the call wouldn't go through. The signal was gone. She was trapped. She looked back at the man who was now standing by the counter, his face twisted into a grotesque smile. What are you? She whispered high, her voice barely audible. The man tilted his head, as if considering her question. I'm the dark roast, he said simply. Lucy blinked, confused. What? Before she could finish her sentence, the lights went out completely, plunging the store into total darkness. She felt a cold hand on her shoulder, and then everything went black. The next morning, Pete arrived at the store at 6 a.m., ready to start the day. But when he unlocked the door, he found the store empty. The chairs were overturned, the counters were still dirty, and the cash register was wide open. There was no sign of Lucy. The only clue was a cup of cold coffee sitting on the counter. The words, dark roast, scrawled on the side in a shaky hand. The police searched the store and the surrounding area, but Lucy was never found. The security cameras showed nothing unusual, just Lucy serving customers as usual until 1:30 a.m. when the footage abruptly cut off. Pete quit his job the next day, unable to shake the feeling that something terrible had happened. The Starbucks remained open, but no one ever took the midnight shift again. And late at night, when the store is empty and the lights start to flicker, some say you can still hear Lucy's voice whispering in the dark. Please, just leave. Leave. Starbucks Horror Stories, The Whispering Brew. When Ben started working at the old Starbucks on Willow Street, he didn't expect anything out of the ordinary. The store was tucked away in a quiet corner of the city, far from the bustling downtown locations. It was an older building with high ceilings, exposed brick, and a vintage charm that drew in a steady stream of customers who appreciated its calm, cozy atmosphere. But there was something about the store that felt off. A subtle wrongness that nagged at the back of Ben's mind, especially during his late shifts. Ben's coworkers had warned him about the Whispering Brew, a silly name they'd given to the strange things that supposedly happened during the last hour of the night. They joked about hearing voices, seeing shadows that shouldn't be there, and feeling an unnatural chill in the air. Ben laughed it off, thinking it was just a way to spook the new guy. One Friday night, Ben found himself alone on the closing shift. The evening had been uneventful, with only a few customers trickling in and out. By 11:30 p.m., the place was empty. The other barista, Kate, had left an hour earlier, leaving Ben to handle the final cleanup. He didn't mind. It was extra pay, and he liked the solitude. As he wiped down the counters, he noticed something strange. The store had grown eerily quiet, quieter than usual. The background hum of the refrigerator, the soft buzz of the fluorescent lights, even the distant sound of traffic outside had all faded away. It was as if the entire world had been muffled, wrapped in a thick blanket of silence. Ben shook his head, trying to shake off the unease. He checked the time, 11:45 p.m., just 15 more minutes and he could lock up and head home. He busied himself with the last few tasks, trying to ignore the growing feeling that he was being watched. As he was putting away the last of the clean dishes, he heard it, a soft whisper, barely audible, coming from behind him. Ben froze, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. He slowly turned around, his eyes scanning the empty store. Nothing. The tables and chairs were all in their places, the lights were still on, and the front door was locked. He was alone. But the whisper came again, this time clearer, like a voice carried on the wind. Ben. His heart skipped a beat. It was his name, whispered in a voice that was both familiar and foreign. a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. He tried to tell himself it was just his imagination, a trick of the mind after a long day. But deep down, he knew that wasn't true. He grabbed a cloth and started wiping down the already clean counter, his hands trembling. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, filling the empty space with their eerie cadence. Ben. Come closer. He couldn't pinpoint where the voice was coming from. It seemed to move around him, always just out of reach, like a shadow slipping through his fingers. His breath quickened and a cold sweat broke out on his forehead. He forced himself to keep working, focusing on the mundane tasks to keep his mind from spiraling. But then the lights flickered, plunging the store into brief moments of darkness before coming back on. Ben's heart pounded in his chest as he looked around, his eyes wide with fear. The whispers had stopped, replaced by an unsettling silence that was worse than the noise. Just as he was about to rush to the door, something caught his eye. In the far corner of the store, near the display of coffee beans, the shadows seemed to move, coalescing into a shape, a dark, shifting figure that stood unnaturally still. Ben blinked, hoping it was just a trick of the light, but the figure remained, watching him with unseen eyes. "Who's there?" Ben's voice wavered, echoing in the empty store. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it began to glide toward him, its form shifting and undulating like smoke in the wind. Ben stumbled back, knocking over a stack of cups. They clattered to the floor, the sound sharp and jarring in the oppressive silence. Panicking, Ben turned and ran toward the front door, but it wouldn't budge. The lock was stuck, and the key wouldn't turn. His hands shook as he fumbled with the lock, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Behind him, the whispers returned, louder now, overlapping in a cacophony of voices. They were coming from all around him, echoing off the walls, the ceiling, the very air itself. "Ben, you can't leave. You're ours now." He pounded on the door, shouting for help. "Okay," but his voice was swallowed by the oppressive quiet of the store. The figure was closer now, just a few feet away, its form indistinct but undeniably menacing. He could feel its presence, cold and dark, pressing in on him from all sides. In a desperate bid to escape, Ben ducked behind the counter, crouching down and trying to make himself as small as possible. He squeezed his eyes shut, praying that whatever was happening would just go away, that he would wake up and find it was all a bad dream. But the whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, more frantic, filling his mind with incoherent babble. The figure loomed over the counter now, its presence a heavy weight on his chest, making it hard to breathe. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything went silent. The whispers stopped, the air cleared, and the oppressive weight lifted. Ben opened his eyes, his heart still racing, and found himself alone in the store. The figure was gone, and the lights had returned to their normal steady glow. He slowly stood up, his legs shaky and weak. The front door was unlocked now, the key turning easily in the lock. Without a second thought, Ben grabbed his coat and bolted out the door, not daring to look back. As he hurried down the street, his mind raced. What had just happened? Was it real, or had his exhaustion finally gotten to him? But deep down, he knew it was real. Too real. The next morning, Ben called in sick, unable to face the thought of going back to that store. When Pete, his manager, asked what was wrong, Ben hesitated before finally admitting what had happened. Pete was silent for a moment before sighing. "You experienced the Whispering Brew," he said quietly. "You're not the first. That store, it's old. There are stories, things we don't talk about. It's best to just move on." Ben never returned to that Starbucks. He found a new job in a different part of town, far away from Willow Street. But sometimes, late at night, when he's alone in his apartment, he swears he can still hear those whispers, calling his name, beckoning him back to the place he swore he'd never go again. And he knows that no matter how far he runs, he'll never be able to escape the dark secrets of the Whispering Brew. Starbucks Horror Stories, The Unseen Customer. Mia had always prided herself on being a skeptic. Ghost stories, urban legends, and tales of the supernatural were nothing more than entertainment to her, a way to pass the time with friends on a chilly night. So when she started her job at the Starbucks on Alder Avenue, she didn't think twice about the rumors she'd heard. The store was supposedly haunted, but that didn't bother her. It was just another coffee shop, one of hundreds in the city. and the ghost stories were probably just a way for bored employees to spook each other during slow shifts. Her first few weeks on the job were normal. She quickly fell into the rhythm of making drinks, chatting with customers, and learning the quirks of the old building. The store had a rustic charm, with creaky wooden floors and dim, warm lighting that made it feel cozy even during the busiest hours. One evening, Mia was scheduled to close up alone. The night had been unusually quiet, with only a handful of customers trickling in after 8 p.m. By 10, the store was empty, and she began the familiar routine of cleaning up, counting the till, and prepping for the morning crew. As she wiped down the counters, she noticed something strange: a cup sitting on the far corner of the counter. It was a plain white Starbucks cup, like any other, but she didn't remember making the drink or handing it to anyone. She frowned, trying to recall if someone had left it there. Must have been a walkout, she muttered to herself, picking it up to throw it away. But as she reached for it, she noticed the name written on the side in neat, precise handwriting. Mia. She froze. Her name wasn't common, and she hadn't taken any orders recently. The store had been empty for the past hour. She glanced around, half expecting someone to jump out and laugh at her reaction, but the store was silent. Uneasily, she opened the lid and peered inside. The cup was empty, spotless, as if it had never been used. A shiver ran down her spine, but she shook it off. Someone's idea of a prank, she decided, tossing the cup into the trash. She went back to her closing duties, but the sense of unease lingered, making her skin prickle. Just as she was about to mop the floor, the doorbell jingled, signaling a customer. Mia looked up, surprised. She hadn't heard anyone enter. The door was still locked, the key hanging from her apron pocket. "Hello?" she called out, her voice wavering slightly. No one answered. She walked around the counter, peering into the seating area, but it was empty. The only sound was the soft jazz playing over the speakers and the faint hum of the coffee machines. She checked the back door in the storeroom, but everything was as it should be, locked and undisturbed. Mia returned to the front, her heart pounding. She tried to laugh it off, telling herself it was just her imagination playing tricks on her. But when she stepped back behind the counter, her breath caught in her throat. Another cup was sitting on the counter. It hadn't been there a moment ago. The name on this one was also written in that same neat handwriting, Mia. Her hands shook as she picked it up, her mind racing. Was someone playing a prank on her? But how? The door was locked, and she was alone. She opened the lid, and once again, the cup was empty. She glanced at the clock, 10:45 p.m. Only 15 minutes until she could close the store and leave. She tried to focus on finishing her tasks, but her eyes kept darting to the counter, half expecting another cup to appear. At 10:55, just as she was about to shut down the register, she heard it, the faintest whisper, coming from behind her. She spun around, but there was no one there. The store was empty, but the whispering continued, soft and unintelligible, like a distant conversation just out of earshot. Her heart raced, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. "Hello?" she called again, her voice trembling. The whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by an oppressive silence. She stood there, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. Then, slowly, she heard it again. This time, her name, spoken softly but clearly, as if someone was standing right behind her. Mia. She whirled around, but no one was there. The store was empty, yet the voice had been so close, so real. Panic set in. She grabbed her keys and rushed to the door, desperate to leave. As she fumbled with the lock, she heard the sound again. This time, a soft thud from behind the counter. She didn't want to look. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to get out of the store and never look back. But some morbid curiosity, some need to confirm what she feared, forced her to turn around. There on the counter was another cup, the same as before, with her name written on it in that perfect handwriting. But this time, the lid was off, and the cup wasn't empty. A dark, thick liquid sloshed inside, almost like tar. The smell hit her then, an acrid metallic scent that made her stomach churn. Her eyes widened in horror as the liquid began to bubble, small ripples forming on the surface. And then, slowly, it started to rise, spilling over the edge of the cup and oozing across the counter like a living thing. The whispers returned, louder now, filling the air with a sinister chant that made her head spin. Mia, Mia, Mia. The liquid reached the edge of the counter and dripped to the floor, but instead of pooling, it began to move, crawling toward her like an inky, sentient mass. Mia backed away, her heart pounding in her ears. The lights flickered, casting the store in an eerie, strobe-like glow. She stumbled back, tripping over a stool and falling hard to the floor. The cup tipped over, spilling the last of the liquid, which now stretched toward her, creeping along the floor with terrifying speed. The whispers grew into a deafening chorus, each voice overlapping the next, drowning out all rational thought. Desperate, Mia scrambled to her feet and bolted for the door. She yanked it open, the cool night air hitting her like a slap to the face. She didn't look back as she ran down the street, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her mind reeling with what she had just experienced. She didn't stop running until she was several blocks away, her legs trembling, her lungs burning. Only then did she dare to look back, expecting to see the dark mass following her. But the street was empty, the Starbucks dark and silent in the distance. Mia quit her job the next day, too shaken to even explain her reasons to Pete. She never spoke about what happened that night, not to her friends, not to her family. But sometimes late at night when she's alone in her apartment, she swears she can still hear those whispers, soft and insistent, calling her name. And on her kitchen counter, a Starbucks cup with her name on it sits, always filled with that dark, bubbling liquid, no matter how many times she throws it away. Starbucks Horror Stories, The Last Order. Jenna had always loved her job at Starbucks. The scent of freshly brewed coffee, the friendly regulars, and the rhythmic routine of crafting the perfect drinks made her shifts enjoyable. But there was one part of her job she didn't love: closing time. The store had been there for decades, and though it had been renovated many times, something about the old building made her uneasy after dark. It was a slow Thursday night, and Jenna was working the closing shift alone. The other barista had called in sick, leaving her to lock up by herself. She didn't mind much. It meant she could get things done quicker and head home earlier. By 10:30 p.m., the store was empty, and she had already started cleaning up. As she wiped down the espresso machine, she heard the door chime ring softly. She looked up, surprised. The store was officially closed. The "Sorry, we're closed" sign clearly displayed in the window. Yet, standing just inside the doorway was a man she had never seen before. He was tall and thin, dressed in an old-fashioned suit that looked like it was from another era. His skin was pale, almost sickly, and his eyes were a shade too dark, like the deep black of a bottomless pit. He stood there, perfectly still, his gaze fixed on Jenna. Sorry, sir," Jenna called out, trying to keep her voice steady. "We're closed for the night." The man didn't move or speak. He simply stared at her, his expression blank, almost as if he hadn't heard her. An uneasy feeling settled in Jenna's stomach. "Is there something I can help you with?" she asked, taking a step toward the counter, hoping to guide him out the door. Finally, the man moved, stepping slowly toward the counter. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, crumpled piece of paper. He placed it on the counter and slid it toward her without a word. Jenna hesitated before picking it up. The paper was old, yellowed with age, and the edges were tattered. Written on it, in neat, old-fashioned handwriting, was an order. 1 cafe Americano, 1 shot of espresso, room for cream, extra hot. It was a simple order, but something about it felt wrong. She couldn't put her finger on it, but the uneasy feeling in her stomach grew stronger. She forced a smile, trying to push away the discomfort. "Sure, I can make that for you. But, we're about to close, so this will have to be the last order of the night." The man didn't respond. He just stood there, watching her with those unnervingly dark eyes. Jenna hurried to make the drink, wanting to get him out of the store as quickly as possible. She could feel his gaze on her the entire time, and it made her skin crawl. As she worked, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The air in the store felt heavy, oppressive, and the usual hum of the equipment seemed muted, almost as if the store itself was holding its breath. When the drink was ready, Jenna placed it on the counter and slid it toward the man. "Here you go," she said, her voice a little too cheerful. "That'll be $4.50. The man didn't reach for the drink. Instead, he just stared at it, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he looked up at Jenna, his dark eyes locking onto hers. "For her," he said in a low, Gravelly voice that sent a shiver down her spine. Jenna blinked, confused. For who? But the man didn't answer. Instead, he turned and walked toward the door, leaving the drink on the counter. Jenna watched him go, her heart pounding. He didn't make a sound as he moved, not even when he pushed open the door. The chime rang again as the door closed behind him, and then he was gone, disappearing into the night. Jenna stood there, staring at the door, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Who was that man? And what did he mean? For her. She looked down at the drink he'd ordered, still sitting on the counter untouched. Something about it made her uneasy, and she had the sudden, irrational urge to get rid of it. She picked it up and headed toward the sink, intending to pour it out. But as she reached the sink, the lights in the store flickered, plunging the room into brief darkness. When the lights came back on, Jenna gasped and nearly dropped the cup. The drink was gone, the cup now empty, with just a few drops of liquid clinging to the bottom. She hadn't poured it out, and there was no one else in the store. So where had it gone? Her heart raced, and she set the empty cup down, stepping back from it as if it might somehow come to life. She glanced around the store, her eyes wide with fear, but nothing seemed out of place. The store was as empty as it had been all night. But then, just as she was about to turn away, she heard a soft sound, like the faint rustle of fabric. She turned back to the counter, and her blood ran cold. Standing where the cup had been was a woman. She was translucent, barely more than a wisp of smoke, but her features were clear. Her eyes were dark, sunken, and filled with sorrow. Her hair was long and matted, hanging in limp strands around her face. Her dress was old-fashioned, like something out of a black and white photograph, and it fluttered around her as if caught in a breeze that Jenna couldn't feel. The woman's eyes locked onto Jenna's, and a wave of cold swept over her, freezing her in place. The woman's lips moved, forming words that Jenna couldn't hear, but she didn't need to hear them to understand. The sorrow in the woman's eyes, the hollow emptiness, said everything. The woman raised a ghostly hand, pointing at the cup. Jenna followed the gesture and saw that the cup was no longer empty. It was filled again with the same dark liquid, now swirling and bubbling as if something were alive inside it. Suddenly, the woman's expression twisted into one of anguish, and she let out a silent scream. The lights flickered again, and the temperature in the store plummeted. Jenna could feel the cold seeping into her bones, making her shiver uncontrollably. The woman's scream seemed to reverberate through the air, even though Jenna couldn't hear it. And the cup began to shake on the counter, its contents threatening to spill over. Just when Jenna thought she couldn't take it anymore, the lights went out completely, plunging the store into pitch darkness. The air was thick with the sound of the woman's silent scream, and Jenna could feel the presence of something dark and terrible, drawing closer. She stumbled backward, her heart racing, and when the lights finally flickered back on, the woman was gone. The cup was still there, but it was now shattered, its pieces scattered across the counter and floor, the dark liquid oozing out like blood. Jenna didn't stay to clean up. She grabbed her things and ran out of the store, not stopping until she was safely locked inside her car. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely get the key into the ignition. She didn't tell anyone what had happened that night. Who would believe her? But she never worked another closing shift at that Starbucks again. Whenever she drove past the store, she couldn't help but feel that cold presence lingering, watching her, waiting for her to return. And every night, as she tried to fall asleep, she would hear the faint sound of a door chime and the whispered words, "For her," echoing in her mind, followed by the ghostly wail of the woman who had been waiting for her drink, waiting for something she would never receive. Jenna knew one thing for sure. She'd never order a cafe Americano again. No, again. Starbucks Horror Stories, The Locked Door. Claire had worked at the Starbucks on 9th Avenue for just over a month, and while the job was mostly routine, there was one detail she couldn't shake, a peculiar sense of unease that lingered in the store. It was a charming location, with high wooden beams and an old-fashioned brick facade, but it had an odd feature that stood out, a locked door at the back of the store. It had no keyhole, just a sturdy, rusted metal door with a sign that read, "Authorized personnel only." The manager, Rick, had given her a vague explanation about the door being for storage purposes, but he didn't elaborate further. Claire didn't question it. She had too much to do to worry about a locked door. However, the mystery of the door intrigued her, and her curiosity was only heightened by the way it seemed to attract her attention during quiet moments. One evening, as she was closing the store alone, Claire began her usual routine, wiping down the counters, mopping the floor, and prepping the store for the next day. The shop was unusually quiet, and the dim lighting cast long shadows across the room. The only sound was the occasional drip of the coffee machine and the distant hum of the refrigerator. As she approached the locked door to check if any cleaning supplies had been left behind, she heard it, a faint scratching sound coming from behind the door. Claire froze, her breath catching in her throat. The scratching was soft but persistent, like nails scraping against wood. She leaned closer to the door, her ear pressed against the cold metal. The scratching continued, and she could almost make out a muffled voice. Her heart raced, and she stepped back, her mind racing with thoughts of what could be behind that door. The store had been empty, and she knew for sure that no one else had been in the building. The scratching grew louder, more frantic, and Claire could feel her courage faltering. She glanced around the store, half expecting someone to jump out and laugh at her, but she was alone. Unable to ignore her curiosity, Claire tried the handle of the locked door, but it didn't budge. The scratching continued, and the voice behind the door grew clearer, though she still couldn't make out any specific words. It sounded almost like someone was trying to communicate, but the words were garbled and desperate. Claire took a deep breath and decided to call Rick. Maybe he could explain what was happening. She dialed his number, her hands shaking as she held the phone to her ear. After a few rings, Rick's voice came through the line, groggy and tired. "Rick, it's Claire. I'm at the store, and there's something really weird happening. I hear scratching and a voice coming from the locked door in the back." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Claire could hear Rick's breathing grow heavier. "Claire, listen carefully," he said, his voice suddenly sharp. "You need to leave the store immediately. Lock the door behind you, and don't come back until I get there." Before Claire could respond, Rick hung up. Her heart pounded, and the scratching behind the door grew more intense, almost as if whatever was on the other side had heard the conversation. She glanced around nervously, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread. Desperate to leave, she gathered her things and made her way to the front door, her steps quick and uneven. She could hear the scratching still, echoing through the store, and the muffled voice had now turned into a frantic, almost pleading tone. Claire fumbled with her keys, trying to unlock the door as quickly as possible. Just as she was about to push it open, she heard a loud crash from behind her. Startled, she spun around to see the locked door shaking violently, as if something inside was trying to break free. Her fear reached its peak. She threw open the front door, locked it behind her, and ran to her car. The engine roared to life, and she sped away from the store, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. When she arrived at her apartment, she was still shaking, her mind racing with the night's events. She tried to call Rick again, but his phone went straight to voicemail. She left a frantic message, hoping he would call back soon. It wasn't until the next morning that Rick finally called her back. His voice was strained, and there was an edge of something in it that made Claire's stomach churn. "Claire, I need you to listen to me carefully," Rick said. "Last night, you weren't supposed to encounter that door. It's been locked for a reason. We have something in there that, well, we thought we had contained it. I'm not sure how it got out." Claire's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean contained? What's behind that door?" Rick sighed heavily. "It's a long story, but the short version is that we had a security breach years ago. Someone tampered with the door, and we had to lock it permanently. It was never supposed to be opened again. There's something in there that we can't explain. A presence, a force. It's been quiet for a long time, but we didn't want to take any chances." Claire's mind raced. "So what was that scratching I heard? And the voice?" Rick's voice was somber. "I can't say for sure. It could be a manifestation of whatever is trapped inside. It's not something we fully understand. For your safety and the safety of others, that door must remain locked." Claire's stomach churned with unease. "Are you saying I shouldn't have heard or seen anything?" Rick was silent for a moment before responding. "Yes, you weren't supposed to. Just stay away from the store until I can arrange for someone to take a look. I'll explain more when I can." The conversation ended, leaving Claire with more questions than answers. She didn't return to the store, and eventually she found a new job elsewhere. The mysterious door and the haunting scratching were left behind, but the fear and uncertainty lingered. Every now and then when she was alone, Claire would think back to that night and wonder what was truly behind that locked door. She knew she'd never get the answers she was looking for, and she was okay with that. Some mysteries, she realized, were best left unsolved. And as she lay in bed at night, she couldn't help but listen for the faintest hint of scratching, hoping it was just a figment of her imagination. But deep down, she knew that whatever was behind that door was still there, waiting, and that the silence was just as unsettling as the sound of its desperate attempts to get out. Starbucks Horror Stories: The Brewed Message. Rachel was new at the Starbucks on Green Street, having just started her first week. The store was bustling, filled with chatter and the smell of freshly ground coffee beans. She was eager to prove herself and fit in with the team, but the store had one peculiar feature that made her uneasy: an old coffee grinder in the corner of the back room that nobody seemed to use anymore. The grinder was a relic from a bygone era, large, dusty, and covered in a patina of age. The staff had told her it was just an old piece of equipment, but Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that it held some kind of hidden significance. It was as if it was waiting for something, or someone. One evening, as Rachel was closing up the store alone, she decided to clean out the back room. She had noticed that the grinder was unusually dirty, and she thought it would be a good idea to tidy up. She approached the old machine with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. As she cleaned, she noticed something odd. The grinder seemed to be filled with a dark, oily substance that didn't look like coffee grounds. She tried to scoop it out with a small brush, but it was sticky and wouldn't come off easily. Her curiosity got the better of her, and she decided to open the grinder to see what was inside. The grinder had a large, rusty handle that creaked as she turned it. Inside, she found a small metal container, heavily tarnished and sealed with a waxy substance. It was an old tin, its surface covered in cobwebs and grime. She pried it open with some effort, revealing a small stack of crumpled papers inside. Rachel took the papers out and began to unfold them. The pages were yellowed and fragile, and as she carefully smoothed them out, she realized they were filled with handwritten notes in a spidery, old-fashioned script. The notes were mostly incoherent, but one message stood out, written in bold, urgent letters. "Help us. We're trapped in the brewed mistake. Find the cups. Find the truth." A chill ran down Rachel's spine. The message was unsettling, and she felt a growing sense of dread. She folded the notes and put them back into the tin, resealing it and placing it back in the grinder. She decided to tell her manager, Tom, about the strange discovery. Tom was skeptical when Rachel described the notes, brushing it off as an old prank or a hoax. "The grinder's been here for years," he said. "It's probably just some forgotten junk." But Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That night, as she lay in bed, she kept thinking about the note. The idea that someone was trapped in a brewed mistake and needed help was too disturbing to ignore. She decided she would investigate further the next day. The following afternoon, while the store was busy, Rachel ventured into the back room to inspect the grinder again. This time, she noticed something new. There were faint but distinct coffee stains on the floor leading to a shelf in the corner. The stains formed a trail, almost like a path leading somewhere. Her heart raced as she followed the trail, which led her to a small storage closet. The closet was cluttered with old coffee cups and boxes, but something about it seemed off. As she rummaged through the items, she found a set of old, mismatched coffee cups stacked together. They were different from the usual ones used in the store, antique, with elaborate designs and a sense of age to them. One cup in particular caught her eye. It was an ornate porcelain cup with a gold rim and a strange emblem on its side. The emblem looked like an old symbol she couldn't quite place. She picked up the cup, feeling a shiver run through her. It felt oddly warm to the touch, despite the cool air of the storage closet. Rachel examined the cup more closely and found something written inside the rim, hidden from view. Using a flashlight, she read the inscription, "To be freed, drink the last brew." The message made no sense, but it was clear that it was connected to the note she had found. Her mind raced with possibilities. Could this be some kind of twisted joke, or was there something more sinister at play? Determined to find out, Rachel decided to take the cup back to the grinder. She filled it with coffee from the store's freshest batch, trying to follow the instructions from the inscription. As she poured the coffee, she noticed something strange. The coffee seemed to swirl and bubble in the cup, as if it was alive. With trembling hands, Rachel took a sip. The coffee was bitter and almost metallic, but she forced herself to drink it, hoping to uncover whatever mystery lay hidden in the cup. As she finished the last sip, she felt a sudden, intense cold envelop her. The lights in the back room flickered, and the temperature dropped dramatically. The walls seemed to close in, and Rachel felt a presence in the room, a cold, oppressive force that seemed to be watching her. The old grinder started to rumble, its metal parts grinding together with an ominous sound. Rachel looked around, her heart pounding. She saw shadowy figures moving in the corners of the room, their shapes indistinct but filled with a sense of urgency. The air grew thick, and she could hear faint, desperate whispers, almost like the voices from the notes. Suddenly, the presence intensified, and Rachel felt as if she was being pulled toward the grinder. The shadows seemed to reach out, their ghostly hands grasping at her, trying to drag her closer. She struggled against the force, her panic rising. Just when she thought she couldn't bear it any longer, the room went silent. The shadows vanished, and the oppressive cold lifted. The grinder stopped its rumbling, and the lights steadied. Rachel was left standing alone in the back room, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The coffee cup was gone, and in its place was a small, neatly folded piece of paper. Rachel picked it up, her hands still shaking. The note read, "Thank you. The brewed mistake has been rectified." The message was cryptic, but Rachel felt a sense of relief. She had no idea what she had just experienced, but she knew she had somehow helped to resolve whatever was haunting the store. Tom arrived later that night, and Rachel explained everything that had happened. Though he was skeptical, he promised to investigate the old grinder and the mysterious cups further. The next day, the old coffee grinder was removed from the store, and the mysterious cups were never seen again. The store returned to normal, but Rachel never forgot the chilling experience. She continued working at the Starbucks, but every time she passed by the empty corner where the grinder had been, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had been set free, and that some mysteries were better left unsolved. Starbucks Horror Stories, The After Hours Brew. It was a quiet Friday night at the Starbucks on 4th Street, and Amelia was finishing her shift. The store had closed an hour ago, and the last of the customers had left. The usual closing duties were nearly done. The espresso machines were cleaned, the floors mopped, and the counters wiped. Amelia, a diligent barista with a knack for thoroughness, decided to tackle the least glamorous job, cleaning out the old brewing machines in the back room. The back room was dimly lit, illuminated only by the soft glow of a single overhead light. It was cluttered with empty boxes, cleaning supplies, and old coffee equipment. Amid the chaos, there was one old coffee maker that hadn't been used in years. It was an ancient model with a brass finish, sitting quietly in the corner, untouched and gathering dust. As Amelia approached it, she noticed something odd. The coffee maker was slightly ajar, as if someone had recently tampered with it. She frowned and decided to inspect it more closely. As she opened the lid, she was hit by a faint but unpleasant smell, a mix of stale coffee and something acrid. She found a half-empty carafe inside, and upon closer inspection, she noticed it had a strange residue at the bottom, something dark and sticky. Amelia wrinkled her nose and decided to clean it out. As she scrubbed the carafe, she noticed an old, faded piece of paper stuck to the side of the machine. It looked like it had been there for years. Curiosity getting the better of her, Amelia carefully peeled the paper off and unfolded it. The paper was brittle and yellowed, and the message written on it was barely legible. It read, When the moon is high, the truth will be revealed. Seek the last brew and uncover what's hidden. The note sent a shiver down Amelia's spine. It sounded like a cryptic riddle, and she couldn't help but feel that it was somehow important. She decided to take the note to the store manager, Lisa, who was in the office preparing the deposit. "Lisa, I found something weird in the back room," Amelia said, holding out the note. "What do you make of this?" Lisa looked up from her paperwork and took the note with a curious glance. She read it slowly, her expression changing from confusion to concern. "That's strange. We don't usually find messages like this around here. Let me look into it." Lisa's curiosity was piqued, and she decided to investigate further. She and Amelia went back to the old coffee maker, trying to decipher the meaning of the note. The cryptic reference to the last brew seemed to be the key. They discovered that the coffee maker had a hidden compartment at its base, which Lisa managed to pry open with some effort. Inside the compartment was a small, dusty box. Lisa carefully lifted it out, and they opened it together. Inside the box were several items: an old, faded photograph of the store from the 1950s, a tarnished silver spoon, and a small, ornate key. The photograph showed the same store, but with a different layout and decor, and the spoon was intricately designed with strange symbols etched into its surface. "This is getting weirder," Lisa said, her eyes narrowing in thought. "The key might be for something in the store. We need to figure out what it opens." They began to search the store for any locks that might match the key. Amelia felt a growing sense of unease as they searched every nook and cranny. The key was small and seemed like it could fit into a variety of locks, but nothing seemed to work. Finally, Lisa noticed a small, hidden door behind a large shelf in the storage room. The door was barely noticeable and had been painted over many times, blending in with the wall. The key fit perfectly into the lock, and with a click, the door creaked open. Inside the small room was a dusty, old archive filled with records, old coffee tins, and outdated equipment. But what caught Amelia's eye was a large, old ledger sitting on a wooden table. The ledger was filled with handwritten notes and records from the 1950s, detailing various brews and customer orders. Lisa carefully flipped through the pages, and Amelia watched as her expression grew more serious. The last few pages of the ledger were marked with unusual symbols and phrases that seemed to match the ones on the spoon. Then they found it. A detailed account of a special coffee blend created during the store's early years. The notes mentioned a final brew prepared on a specific night, a brew that was supposed to be hidden away as a secret. The account was cryptic, mentioning that the last brew had unseen effects when consumed under the full moon. This must be what the note was talking about, Lisa said. But what could it mean? As they continued to read, they discovered that the brew was meant to be consumed only on certain nights for a ritual that the store's founders had believed would reveal hidden truths or secrets. The ritual was meant to take place during the full moon. Amelia and Lisa glanced at the calendar and realized that tonight was indeed a full moon. A sense of dread washed over them as they decided to follow the instructions described in the ledger. They brewed the old recipe from the notes using the antique coffee maker and prepared to uncover whatever secrets lay hidden. As the moonlight streamed through the store's windows, they poured the final brew into 2 old-fashioned cups and took a cautious sip. The coffee was bitter and strange, with a taste that was almost metallic. Almost immediately, the store began to change. The temperature dropped, and a ghostly fog began to seep through the walls. Shadows danced in the corners, and eerie whispers filled the air. The old store seemed to come alive with an otherworldly presence. Then the lights flickered, and a spectral figure appeared in the middle of the room. It was a woman dressed in vintage clothing, her face somber and her eyes filled with a mournful sadness. She floated above the floor, her presence chilling and unsettling. The woman spoke in a soft, ethereal voice. "Thank you for freeing me. For decades, I've been trapped in this place, bound by the ritual that went wrong. The last brew was meant to release me, but it was never completed. You have set me free." Lisa and Amelia stood frozen in shock as the figure began to fade. Who are you?" Lisa asked, her voice trembling. "I was the store's founder's wife," the spirit replied. "My husband was obsessed with the idea of revealing hidden truths through coffee. He performed a ritual that trapped me in this place. Now that the final brew has been completed, I can finally rest. With that, the spirit vanished and the store returned to normal. The fog dissipated and the shadows receded. The temperature returned to its usual warmth, and the store was silent once more. Lisa and Amelia were left alone, their hearts still racing. They looked at each other, trying to process what had just happened. "Well," Lisa said, finally breaking the silence, "that was certainly not what I expected when I signed up for this job." Amelia nodded, still in shock. "I guess some things are better left undiscovered, but I'm glad we were able to help." From that night on, the old coffee maker and the mysterious brew were never mentioned again. The store continued its daily operations, but the memory of the spectral encounter and the secrets uncovered lingered in their minds. The ledger and the artifacts were carefully stored away, never to be used again. And every time they brewed a fresh pot of coffee, they couldn't help but wonder if there were other secrets lurking in the shadows, waiting to be revealed by the next full moon. Starbucks Horror Stories, The Midnight Blend. It was a sweltering August night when Daniel, the new barista at the Starbucks on Elm Street, was tasked with closing up alone. The store had been particularly busy that day, with a constant stream of customers seeking solace from the summer heat. As the last customer left and the doors were locked, Daniel began his closing routine, looking forward to a quiet night and the end of his shift. The store's interior was cozy, with its warm lighting and comfortable chairs, but tonight it felt unusually oppressive. The summer heat had not abated, and the store seemed to hold on to the warmth. The AC was broken, and the hum of the overhead fan did little to alleviate the discomfort. As Daniel cleaned the espresso machines and wiped down the counters, he noticed something odd. In the back room, where the old supplies and equipment were stored, there was a faint, sweet aroma coming from one of the old storage cabinets. It was a scent he hadn't smelled before. Rich and aromatic, like a blend of spices and coffee, but with a hint of something else, something he couldn't quite place. Curious, Daniel opened the cabinet to find an assortment of old coffee beans in dusty, sealed bags. The labels were faded and the bags were worn, but one bag in particular caught his eye. It was different from the rest, an ornate, vintage package with an elegant script reading, "Midnight Blend." Intrigued, Daniel decided to investigate further. He carefully opened the bag and was met with a rush of the mysterious aroma. The beans inside were dark and glossy, almost as if they had been coated in a strange, shimmering substance. Daniel decided to brew a pot of the Midnight Blend. He figured it would be a good way to test out the old beans and see if they were still any good. He set up the old coffee maker in the back room and brewed a small pot. As the coffee dripped into the carafe, the scent intensified, filling the store with a rich, heady aroma. After a few minutes, the brewing process was complete. Daniel poured himself a cup of the Midnight Blend and took a cautious sip. The coffee was surprisingly smooth and flavorful, with a taste that was both familiar and otherworldly. There was a sweetness to it that he couldn't quite place, and a subtle undertone that made him feel strangely uneasy. As he sipped his coffee, Daniel noticed that the lights in the back room began to flicker. The temperature seemed to drop suddenly, and the room was filled with a strange, unnatural chill. He shrugged it off, attributing it to the faulty air conditioning and his own tiredness. But then the store's ambiance began to shift. The walls seemed to warp and twist, and the shadows in the room grew long and distorted. Daniel felt a growing sense of disorientation, as if the familiar space was morphing into something else entirely. The flickering lights cast eerie patterns on the walls, creating ghostly images that seemed to dance and writhe. The sweet aroma of the Midnight Blend grew stronger, almost intoxicating. Daniel could hear faint whispers coming from nowhere and everywhere at once, voices murmuring in a language he couldn't understand. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and Daniel felt a wave of panic wash over him. He tried to shake off the feeling and finish his tasks, but the more he tried to focus, the more the whispers seemed to invade his mind. He could feel a presence in the room, a dark, oppressive force that seemed to be closing in on him. Suddenly, the carafe of coffee on the counter began to bubble and froth as if it were boiling, despite the fact that the coffee maker was turned off. Daniel watched in horror as the coffee swirled and twisted, forming strange shapes and patterns. The whispers grew louder, almost forming coherent sentences. Daniel's heart raced as he realized that the whispers were not just random noise, they were speaking directly to him. The voices seemed to be pleading, begging for something he couldn't quite grasp. "Help us! Free us! The ritual must be completed." The words repeated over and over, growing louder and more desperate. Daniel felt an overwhelming urge to get out of the store, but his feet felt glued to the floor. The shadows in the room seemed to stretch out toward him, their dark forms reaching for him with ghostly hands. In a moment of sheer panic, Daniel grabbed the carafe of the midnight blend and threw it against the wall. The coffee splattered across the room, and the whispers ceased abruptly. The lights flickered one last time and then went out completely, plunging the store into darkness. Daniel's breath came in short, ragged bursts as he stumbled toward the front of the store, fumbling for his phone to call for help. As he reached the front door, he noticed something chilling. The reflection of the store's interior in the glass showed shadows moving independently of the light, their shapes writhing and shifting in a way that defied explanation. He finally managed to unlock the door and burst outside, gasping for fresh air. The cool night breeze felt like a lifeline as he ran to his car and drove away from the store, not looking back. The next morning, when Daniel returned with the police and a repair team, the store appeared completely normal. There was no sign of the strange occurrences from the night before, and the midnight blend beans were nowhere to be found. The coffee maker was cleaned, and the back room was tidy, with no evidence of the chaos Daniel had witnessed. Lisa, the store manager, was skeptical of Daniel's story, but she could see that he was shaken. She assured him that the store would be checked thoroughly and promised to address any issues with the equipment. Though the store returned to its normal routine, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that something had been awakened by the midnight blend. The whispers, the shadows, and the eerie presence all seemed too real to ignore. He decided to leave the job, unable to endure the lingering sense of unease. The midnight blend was never mentioned again, and the old beans were quietly discarded. The store continued its operations, but every time a customer asked about the old coffee maker or the vintage blends, Lisa couldn't help but feel a twinge of unease. In the end, the midnight blend remained a mystery, a dark chapter in the store's history that was best left forgotten. And for Daniel, the memory of that night haunted him long after he left the job, a chilling reminder of the unknown and the inexplicable horrors that can lurk behind the most ordinary of places. Starbucks Horror Stories: The Hidden Recipe. Lily had been a barista at the Starbucks on Oak Street for nearly a year, and while her job had its ups and downs, she mostly enjoyed the work. The store was a charming little place with a cozy atmosphere and a loyal customer base. However, there was one part of the store that always gave her the creeps: the basement. The basement was used for storage and was filled with old coffee equipment, boxes of supplies, and rarely used inventory. It was also where the store's old recipe books were kept. Lily had always avoided going down there if she could help it, preferring to leave that part of the job to the more seasoned employees. One evening, as she was closing up the store alone, Lily noticed that the basement door was slightly ajar. She had planned to finish her closing duties and leave quickly, but a small box of forgotten syrups that needed to be moved caught her eye. She decided to retrieve the box from the basement, thinking it would be a quick task. With a sigh, she descended the creaky wooden stairs into the dimly lit basement. The air was cool and stale, and the faint smell of old coffee and dust filled her nostrils. As she moved to retrieve the box, her eyes were drawn to a small wooden cabinet in the corner of the room that she had never noticed before. Curiosity getting the better of her, Lily approached the cabinet. It was old and ornate, with intricate carvings that hinted at a bygone era. The cabinet was locked, but it had an old-fashioned keyhole, and Lily couldn't resist trying to open it. To her surprise, she found a small key hanging on a hook nearby that looked like it might fit. With a mix of excitement and trepidation, Lily unlocked the cabinet. Inside, she found an assortment of old, dusty recipe books. They were leather-bound and worn, their pages yellowed with age. Lily picked up one of the books and blew off the dust, revealing a cover with the faded words, Secret Blends and Brews. The book was filled with handwritten recipes for various coffee blends and syrups, but there was one recipe that caught her eye. It was written in a flowing, elegant script and titled The Midnight Brew. The recipe was detailed and included ingredients and instructions that seemed both intriguing and strange. As she read through the recipe, Lily noticed that it required several unusual ingredients, including rare spices and herbs. The instructions were cryptic, mentioning something about brewing the blend under the light of the full moon and adding a drop of the essence of shadows. Lily thought it was an elaborate joke or a piece of old folklore, but she couldn't help feeling a sense of unease. Despite her better judgment, Lily decided to try making the midnight brew. It was a quiet night, and the full moon was visible through the basement window. She gathered the ingredients from the store's inventory and followed the recipe as best she could, including the strange essence of shadows, which she interpreted as a touch of espresso concentrate. As she brewed the coffee, the basement grew colder, and a dense fog seemed to settle around her. The air was filled with an aromatic, almost otherworldly scent, and Lily's heart began to race. The brewing process seemed to take longer than usual, and the coffee emitted a faint, eerie glow. Finally, the brew was ready. Lily poured a cup and took a cautious sip. The taste was rich and complex, with flavors she had never experienced before. There was a sweetness to it, but also a bitterness that seemed to linger on her tongue. She felt a strange sensation, almost as if the coffee was affecting her mind. As she finished her cup, the basement lights flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. The temperature dropped drastically, and Lily could hear faint whispers echoing through the space. The whispers grew louder, forming coherent words that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Welcome to the other side." Lily's pulse quickened, and she fumbled for her phone, trying to turn on the flashlight. When she finally managed to get some light, she saw that the basement was no longer as it had been. The walls seemed to shimmer and warp, and the shadows in the room seemed to move with a life of their own. In the dim light, Lily saw a figure standing at the far end of the basement. It was a shadowy form, vaguely human but distorted and insubstantial. The figure seemed to be watching her, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. Lily's fear turned to panic. She stumbled back, knocking over boxes and trying to find her way to the stairs. The whispers grew louder, becoming a cacophony of voices pleading and calling out in a language she couldn't understand. Desperate to escape, Lily dashed up the stairs, slamming the basement door shut behind her. The whispers and the coldness seemed to follow her, and she could feel the presence of the shadowy figure lingering, even as she locked the door. Panting and terrified, she quickly finished her closing duties and left the store, her mind racing with thoughts of what she had seen. She tried to call her manager, but her phone was dead, and she couldn't get through. The events of the night felt surreal, like a waking nightmare. The next morning, when Lily returned to the store with a sense of dread, she found everything back to normal. The basement was clean and well lit, with no sign of the strange occurrences from the night before. The midnight brew was gone, and the recipe book had mysteriously vanished. Lisa, the store manager, was skeptical when Lily told her about the night's events. She assured Lily that it must have been a result of stress and exhaustion, and that the basement was safe and secure. Nevertheless, Lily was shaken and found it hard to shake the feeling of being watched. She decided to leave the job soon after, unable to shake the haunting memory of that night. The basement was never mentioned again, and the midnight brew became a legend among the staff, a chilling reminder of the mysterious and unsettling forces that can lie hidden in the most ordinary of places. Lily moved on, but the experience left an indelible mark on her. Every time she saw the full moon, she couldn't help but remember the dark, eerie presence that had emerged from the depths of the basement and the terrifying brew that had revealed it. The midnight brew remained an enigma, a dark chapter in the history of the Starbucks on Oak Street that was better left unexplored.